The archive footage ran for 11 seconds. That was all the Vorrkai High Tribunal had deemed necessary to preserve. 11 seconds of a human male in a red flight suit pulling a crippled transport clear of a debris field with his bare hands, 300 kilometers above the colony on Castle of Fee. The footage was grainy, compressed, passed through 6 different relay systems before it reached the tribunal's archive, but you could still see his face when he let the transport go. Not triumph. Not the bared teeth performance the Vorrkai expected from a species they had classified as territorial and aggressive. Just a man catching his breath. Just a man checking to make sure the hull seals held. The archive tag beneath the footage read, Human Asset Status Retired. Threat Assessment Negligible. That was 11 years ago. The man's name was Cade Varish, and he was sleeping under a cargo pallet on the docking level of Threshold Station when Yenatal found him. She had been looking for 3 days. The station's AI had flagged 16 possible matches, and she'd run down 15 of them personally. 2 were dead. 4 had never been Cade Varish at all, and the rest were people who had simply stopped wanting to be found. Threshold Station had a gift for collecting those. It was the kind of place that existed in the gap between jurisdictions, a compressed tangle of airlocks and hawker stalls and repair bays that smelled permanently of ozone and recycled cooking fat, where the lighting was perpetually amber because someone had long ago decided that people behaved better in amber light and had been repeatedly proved wrong. Varish was curled on his side with a recycled thermal sheet pulled up to his ear. He was wearing the same cargo pants and frayed jacket she'd seen in the last known photograph, which was itself 7 years old. He looked like a man who had made peace with sleeping on floors. Yenna crouched beside him and said his name. He didn't open his eyes. Whatever you're selling, he said, I already have one. I'm not selling anything. Then go away. The Vorrkai have a compliance weapon, she said. They've been deploying it in the outer settlements. Resonance wave emitter gets into the low-frequency receptors in the human auditory system, and it's not painful. That's the thing. It just makes people agreeable. Makes them want to move where the Vorrkai tell them to move. Sign what the Vorrkai tell them to sign. 70,000 people in the castle belt have already been relocated. They think they chose it. Varish was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the thermal sheet down from his ear and looked at her with the flat, careful eyes of a man assessing a threat vector. He had a bruise along his jaw that was going yellow at the edges. His silver hair was long enough to touch his collar, and his collar was stained. Why are you telling me this? He said. It wasn't a question. It was the first move in a negotiation he'd already decided to lose. Because you stopped them once before, when they tried the resonance array over Castle of Orve. I was a different person then. I know. I don't have the implants anymore. He sat up slowly, the way men sit up when their backs have stopped cooperating with their ambitions. When they revoked my operational status, they took the neural augmentation too. I'm not what I was. Yenna sat down cross-legged on the floor across from him. Around them, the docking level hummed and ticked, with the sounds of a station going about its business. Carts moving, voices overlapping. Someone 3 bays down arguing about a coolant manifold with the focused passion of a person for whom coolant manifolds were the most important thing in the universe. I know, she said again. I read your file. Then you know why they revoked my status. You broke the Alcindra Accord. You intervened in a Vorrkai resettlement action without authorization. I stopped them from moving 600 people into a radiation zone. You violated 3 separate jurisdictional agreements and used enhanced human capabilities against a recognized diplomatic entity during an active treaty negotiation. She said it neutrally, the way you say something you've memorized. I know what it looks like on paper. I know what it looked like from where you were standing. Varish studied her. She was young, younger than he'd expected, dark-skinned with close-cropped hair and the kind of posture that came from years of moving through spaces where being small and confident was better than being tall and uncertain. She wore a compact investigator's badge on her jacket, but no sidearm. Either she was very trusting or very sure of herself, and nothing about her suggested trust came easily. "Who sent you?" he said. "No one. I came on my own. That's the part I believe least." She reached into her jacket and set a data chip on the floor between them. "That's the full architecture of the compliance weapon. 12 settlements affected so far. 30 more flagged for deployment. The Vorrkai are calling it a voluntary migration initiative." Varish didn't pick up the chip. He looked at it the way you look at a door opens onto something you can't walk back from. "I haven't flown in 6 years, he said. "I know. The augmentation suppression they gave me, it's not a clean block. The neural pathways are still there, they're just..." He stopped. Started again. "It's like trying to remember a language you dreamed in. The words are there, but they won't come when you call. There's a specialist on Castle Afi. She thinks she can restore partial function." Enough. Enough for what exactly? Yenna picked up the data chip and held it out to him. "The compliance weapon is being staged from a converted ore platform in the L4 position of the castle belt. 1 operator, maybe 6 support crew. Weapon itself is the vulnerability. It runs on a resonance loop, which means it's also susceptible to resonance disruption. If someone could get close enough to introduce a counter-frequency, someone with neural augmentation that interfaces with resonance band technology." "The pathways are still there," she said. He took the chip. He held it for a moment, turning it in his f's, and then he put it in his jacket pocket and stood up and folded the thermal sheet with a carefulness that seemed out of place. A man who had almost nothing treating the almost nothing with respect. "I'll need to eat something," he said, "and I'm going to need better boots." The specialist's name was Dr. Amara fell, and she worked out of a prefab clinic on the edge of the Castle of Ice settlement that smelled of antiseptic and the particular metallic warmth of active medical equipment. She was a small woman with silver-streaked locks and reading glasses that she wore pushed up on her forehead even when she wasn't reading, as if she might need them suddenly and urgently at any moment. She ran 3 hours of diagnostics on Varish's neural architecture with the focused satisfaction of an engineer examining an interesting machine. And then she sat back and looked at him over her pushed-up glasses and said, "The suppression lattice they used is old tech, compact era, early generation. It was designed for permanent block, but the pathways in your case are..." She choosing words. "They healed around it, like a tree growing around a fence post. The fence post is still there, but it's not doing much anymore. Can you remove it? I can disrupt it. Partially. You'll get maybe 60% of your previous resonance sensitivity back. Maybe 70 on a good day." She pulled off her glasses and cleaned them on her sleeve. "It'll hurt. Disrupting a suppression lattice it's not a gentle process." "How long?" 4 hours. Maybe 5. Varish looked at the ceiling of the clinic. Through the prefab walls, he could hear the settlement going about its evening. Kids somewhere, the flat percussion of cooking, smells finding their way through every seal and vent. He thought about the thermal sheet on the docking level. He thought about 11 seconds of archive footage. "All right," he said. She put her glasses back on her forehead. "There's something else. I pulled up your Castle of E records. The action at the orbital platform in 14. Yes, the Vorrkai filed a formal protest that you had displayed what they called non-standard human physiological response. They said, I'm quoting, the subject demonstrated threat parameters inconsistent with baseline human classification. She was watching him carefully now. What they meant was they were scared of you. They weren't scared, they were surprised. There's a difference. Is there? He met her eyes. When they saw a human doing something they hadn't calculated for, they called it non-standard. Filed a protest, tried to get it classified as a violation. He paused. It was just me. It's always just the person in front of them. Amara Fell nodded slowly and went to prepare her instruments and didn't say anything else about it. The Vorrkai commander overseeing the compliance initiative was called Orchestrator Designate Vrenish, and it had been running voluntary migration initiatives for 11 years without a single significant disruption. It was, by the Vorrkai assessment rubric, exceptionally good at its function. Vrenish operated from the converted ore platform with 6 subordinates and a chorus unit. The resonance wave emitter that the Vorrkai documentation described as a harmonics-based behavioral facilitation system designed to support cooperative settlement transition. The chorus unit was approximately the size of a cargo container, matte black, covered in the delicate geometric etchings that the Vorrkai used to mark things they considered aesthetically functional. It hummed at a frequency just below conscious hearing and had been humming for 3 months, and in those 3 months 70,000 people had politely signed forms agreeing to relocate. When the alert came that an unauthorized vessel had docked with the platform's secondary airlock, Vrenish processed it with calm efficiency. It activated the platform's internal response protocol, which had been designed with what Vrenish considered generous redundancy. A series of escalating deterrent systems intended to address any intruder short of a full military asset. Vrenish sent the first team. Varish came through the secondary airlock wearing borrowed environment gear that was slightly too large across the shoulders and boots that finally fit, and he stopped when he saw the 4 Vorrkai security units waiting in the corridor. They were tall. The Vorrkai were always tall, built for the lower gravity of their home system, with the fluid, deliberate movements of things that had evolved in environments where haste was a waste of energy. Their exoskeletal plating was the color of old copper, and their eyes, which were compound and didn't blink, caught the overhead lighting and turned it into something cold. Varish raised his hands, empty, and said, "I'm here to talk to whoever's running the chorus unit." The Vorrkai didn't talk. They activated the first deterrent, a localized sonic pulse designed to disorient. It was, in a fine irony, a resonance-based system. For someone with restored resonance sensitivity, it was loud the way a very specific frequency is loud. Varish felt it in his back teeth and behind his eyes. But he'd spent 4 hours in Amarafel's clinic, and he'd come out the other side of something that had hurt more than he'd expected and less than he'd feared. And his nervous system was doing things it hadn't done in 6 years, and the pulse hit him, and he rode it. He walked through the first team without drama. It was not graceful. It was not elegant. It was a 53-year-old man who had spent 6 years sleeping on cargo pallets, remembering something in his hands and his bones that turned out not to have gotten him after all. Vrenish reviewed the feed from the corridor cameras and escalated to the second deterrent. The second was a physical barrier, a pressure gate designed to pin an intruder against the bulkhead with approximately 800 kilograms of force. It engaged as Varish reached the central corridor junction, and it caught him, and he pushed back. The gate's force sensors, which were calibrated against Vorrkai physiological parameters, registered the counterpressure and flagged it as a system malfunction. The gate escalated to maximum capacity. Varish, who was sweating now, his jaw tight and his hands white-knuckled on the gate's frame, said something under his breath that was possibly a word and possibly just a sound that meant keep going, and the gate ground against him for 6 seconds, and then something in its hydraulics gave, not catastrophically but decisively, and it stopped. Vrenish looked at the cameras. Then it sent a message to the chorus unit's operator. Divert 70% of the system's resonance output inward. Flood the platform. Saturate. Make the human pliant. The chorus unit's hum deepened. The platform's walls seemed to flex. And in the central corridor, Varish stopped walking. He stood very still. His hands were at his sides. The resonance was inside everything. Inside the metal of the walls. Inside the recycled air. Inside the fluid in his joints. The Vorrkai had built this system to make people agreeable, to smooth out resistance the way water smooths stone, slowly and completely, until the stone doesn't remember being anything other than smooth. He could feel it working. That was the terrible part. It wasn't pain. It wasn't coercion. It was a warmth at the base of his skull that said, "This doesn't have to be hard. You could just stop. You could just let this be someone else's problem. You tried. You showed up. That's enough, isn't it? That's more than anyone expected. He stood in the corridor with the warmth at the base of his skull and thought about the archive footage. 11 seconds. A man catching his breath, checking hull seals, not triumph, just the next thing. He thought about Yenatal sitting cross-legged on a docking-level floor, handing him a data chip, not asking him to be what he'd been, just asking him to be here. He thought about 70,000 people who didn't know they'd been agreeable. He reached into the resonance the way you reach for a language you dreamed in. The words were there. They came. His augmentation, restored to 60-something% by 4 hours of deliberate pain, didn't fight the chorus unit's output. It did something more specific. It found the resonance loop, the feedback architecture that made the system self-sustaining, and it introduced a counter-frequency. Not a block, not a wall. Just a note struck cleanly at exactly the wrong frequency for the loop to maintain itself. The Vorrkai had built a beautiful, precise machine. Precision, it turns out, is also a vulnerability. The chorus unit ran a diagnostic, found the counter-frequency. Compensated. Varish shifted the counter-frequency by 4 Hz. The unit compensated again. He shifted again. This went on for approximately 90 seconds, a man in a corridor having an argument with a machine the size of a cargo container, conducted entirely in frequencies below the range of hearing. And then the loop stuttered and collapsed, and the chorus unit went silent in the way that large machines go silent, which is to say not silence exactly, but the cessation of a noise you hadn't consciously registered until it stopped. The warmth at the base of Varish's skull went with it. He stood in the corridor, breathing. His nose was bleeding, which he hadn't noticed until just then. He found the wall with one hand and leaned against it and thought with the uncomplicated sincerity of a man who has just done a hard thing. That was extremely unpleasant. Vrenish came to the corridor itself. This was not standard procedure. Orchestrator designates did not typically enter contested areas, but the cameras had stopped functioning at some point in the previous 90 seconds, and Vrenish had direct sensory confirmation of what had occurred. The human was leaning against the wall. It was bleeding from the nose. Its borrowed environment gear was torn at one shoulder. It looked, by any objective assessment, like something that had been through a significant ordeal. Vrenish stood in the corridor and looked at it and tried to reconcile what the cameras had shown with its operational models. The compliance system had not failed. The compliance system could not fail in this specific way. A counter-frequency introduced by a single human nervous system was not a modeled threat vector. It was not a classified human capability. It was not in the archive. It said, in the careful complex standard translation mode that the Vorrkai used for official communications, what you have done is not possible by baseline human parameters. Varish looked up from the wall. His eyes were steady in a face that was tired and bloody and not particularly impressed with anything. I've been hearing that my whole life, he said, and it keeps not being true. Vrenish processed this. Then it said, the compliance system represents 11 years of operational development. The resonance architecture was designed to be self-correcting against external interference. It was very good design. Varish pushed off the wall. The self-correction is what got it. You built a loop that had to respond to interference. I just gave it something to chase. There was a pause that, in a human, would have been called thinking. In a Vorrkai orchestrator designate, it was called operational re-evaluation, and it took approximately the same amount of time. You will not be permitted to leave this platform, Vrenish said. Additional security assets are 18 minutes from docking. I know. Varish looked down the corridor toward the chorus unit's chamber. Your compliance records. The signed migration agreements. I need access to the data core. Those records are protected under the Voluntary Resettlement Charter. Voluntary, Varish said, and the word had a particular weight to it, not angry, just precise. Another pause. What you are asking would constitute a diplomatic incident of significant magnitude. Yes, the compact would be required to respond formally. There would be hearings, investigations, jurisdictional challenges. the process would take years. I know. And at the end of that process, Vrenish said, with what might have been something like curiosity, if the Vorrkai experienced curiosity, you would be the one who caused it. A human with a revoked operational status who boarded a Vorrkai platform without authorization and disabled a compliance by means the compact has not formally classified. I know that too. Why? Said Vrenish. You have nothing left to protect. No status, no authorization. The humans you would help do not know you exist. You will gain nothing. Varish thought about this for a moment. The corridor hummed around them. The background noise of a machine still running, the chorus unit supporting systems, life support, the patient bureaucratic infrastructure of something that had expected to go on working indefinitely. They thought they chose it, he said, moving, signing. They made a decision in a room that was full of something telling them to decide a certain way. And they'll spend the rest of their lives thinking it was their own idea. He looked at Vrenish steadily. People are allowed to change their minds, but the choice has to be theirs. Vrenish stood in the corridor of its platform. Behind it, the chorus unit was quiet for the first time in 3 months. Ahead of it, the data core, with 11 years of compliance records, sat in its housing, waiting. It was an orchestrator designate. It had been running voluntary migration initiatives for 11 years without a significant disruption. It was, by any objective measure, very good at its function. It stepped aside. The hearings took 14 months. Varish testified on 6 separate occasions. He sat in front of panels of compact investigators and answered questions about band interference and neural augmentation and the specifics of the Alcindra Accord, and on 2 occasions the Vorrkai delegation's legal advocate made formal objection to his presence in the room on the grounds that he was operating outside his certified capacity, and both times the panel chair noted the objection and continued. Yenna Tal was there on most days. She sat in the observer section with a tablet on her knee and took notes in a handwriting so small it was nearly decorative. Sometimes, when the proceedings got particularly procedural, which was often, compact hearings were enthusiastically procedural. She and Varish would exchange a look from across the room that said, "Yes, this is what it is." Migration agreements were suspended pending review after the 3rd month. In the 7th month, the Compact's Resonance Tech Panel published a classification decision that listed counter-frequency disruption via restored neural augmentation as a documented human capability. The Vorrkai delegation filed a formal protest. The protest was noted and filed. In the 14th month, the panel issued its findings. The compliance system was ruled a violation of the Compact's Autonomous Decision Charter. 70,000 migration agreements were opened for voluntary review. The Voluntary Resettlement Charter was amended to require independent verification of consent. The Vorrkai were formally censured, which was a word that meant roughly, you knew and you did it anyway, and now the document says so. Varish's operational status was not restored. That was not part of the findings, and it was not something anyone had promised him, and he had not asked. He was in a transit lounge on Castle 4, waiting for a ship to somewhere he hadn't decided yet, when Yenna found him again. She sat down across from him with 2 cups of something hot, and set one in front of him without asking. "The panel is recommending a formal review of your status suspension," she said. "I heard it could take another year. 18 months. I know." She looked at him. He was wearing new boots and a jacket that fit, and he'd had his hair cut. He still had the look of a man who knew how to sleep on floors, but it sat differently now. Less like resignation, more like a skill. "What will you do," she said, "if they restore it?" He picked up the cup. The something hot was tea, or the transit lounge's approximation of tea, which was close enough. Same thing I'd do if they don't, which is... He thought about 11 seconds of archive footage, a man checking hull seals, not the moment before, not the moment after. Just the checking. "Whatever's next," he said. Outside the lounge's viewport, Casacal Belt turned in its slow arc around the system's star. The ore platforms and the transit stations and the settlements, where 70,000 people were having conversations with neighbors and receiving correspondence from the compact and reading, for the first time, documents that explained what had been done to them and giving themselves the time they needed to feel whatever they felt about it. The ship wasn't boarding yet. He drank his tea. Somewhere in the Vorrkai High Tribunal's archive, the footage of a man catching his breath above a colony platform was still tagged. Human asset, status, retired, threat assessment, negligible. Nobody had gotten around to updating it. That was all right. He had never particularly needed the tribunal to know what he was. He barely needed to know it himself. It was enough to know it in the moments when it counted. When the resonance loop was chasing a counter-frequency, and the warmth was at the base of his skull, and the wall was there if he needed it, and the thing that made him human was not the augmentation or the status or the archive footage or any of it, but the specific, stubborn, non-standard human parameter fact that he had decided what mattered, and then he had gone and done it. Outside, the belt turned. He finished his tea and waited for what came next.